Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Sports Report, the archived editions. I'm Dave Rush in St. David's, just north of Niagara Falls, along with John Poulter in Toronto. John, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Dave. Always fun to chat with you on the Sports Archives.
It sure is. And today we're going to look at the career of NHL standout, goaltender, and Hall of Famer Jacques Plante. And so, John, let's get into the career of Jacques Plante and the life of Jacques Plante.
Jacques Plante was a very interesting character in a number of ways. And just to give you a bit of a flavor of why this man is famous, specifically from his playing days, let's take a quick look at his playing stats. 9 full seasons with the Montreal Canadiens, 2 full seasons with the New York Rangers, 2 with the St. Louis Blues, 2 full seasons with the Toronto Maple Leafs, a third season that he started with the Toronto Maple Leafs, traded to the Boston Bruins towards the end of the season for their playoff drive, and finally finished up with 1 year in the World Hockey Association with the old Edmonton Oilers. Looking at his individual stats very quickly, 837 games in the NHL. 437 of those were wins and 145 were ties. He played in the era where ties were part of the game. Interesting that he hasn't played since 1975, and he's still, I believe, 7th or 8th in all-time wins for NHL goaltenders. And keep in mind that when he played, the NHL season was 70 games, and now it's 82. So goaltenders have a lot more opportunity to win games now. So that to me is a record that really stands out and speaks to his longevity and, of course, the fact that he played on some very good teams. 8 times a participant in the NHL All-Star Game, 3 times a first-team NHL All-Star, 4 times a second-team NHL All-Star, Hart Memorial Trophy winner as the NHL's most valuable player once. That was in 1962. A 6-time Stanley Cup winner, 7 times winner or co-winner of the Vezina Trophy as the NHL's leading goaltender. He spent 1 year as coach and general manager of the Quebec Nordique of the World Hockey Association, elected to the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1978, elected to the Canada Sports Hall of Fame in 1981, and elected to the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame in 2010. So a lot of achievements for this man.
All right, John. I always wondered. You're the hockey aficionado here. It seems to me like the goalie position is kind of like the catcher position in baseball. In a way, it's just so much different than everybody else and what they're doing out there. Describe the position and what attributes you really need to be a great goaltender.
Well, that's a very good comparison, Dave. You need to be a thinker, obviously. You see the game totally differently than everybody else does. You see the entire rink the same way that a catcher sees the entire field of play. You have to know every other team's players and their favorite positions, their favorite moves, their strengths, their weaknesses, and you're on the ice the whole time. Unlike the rest of the hockey players on a team, they're only playing every second, third, or fourth shift, depending on how tight the game is. In most cases, it's every fourth shift. They're only playing in 45-second to 1-minute spells. The goaltender's out there for the whole game, and he has to learn to work with all of his teammates, and he has to know the league. So it's an interesting spot to play. The one thing that's vastly different is that we've talked before about the number of former catchers in Major League Baseball that become Major League managers because of the fact that they are familiar with the whole game. It's almost the opposite in the National Hockey League. There are very few goaltenders that became head coaches, and even few that became good head coaches. So that would be the one difference. But your point is well taken that there are a lot of similarities.
All right. Well, let's take a look at the early life of Jacques Plante.
Well, if you go along the St. Lawrence River between the city of Montreal and Quebec City, about halfway along the North Shore, you'll come to a city by the name of Trois-Rivières, which the English translation is 3 rivers. And you go about 12 miles north of Trois-Rivières, and you come to a small village called Notre Dame. That is the home of Jacques Plante. It's where he was born in 1947. And He was born on a farm. He was the eldest of 11 children. The family moved to Shawinigan Falls, which is about 8 or 9 miles north of Notre Dame, when he was a very small boy, as his father was employed in the mining industry. So that's basically where he learned to play hockey. And the Christmas of 1936 brought his first regulation goal stick as a Christmas present. His father made him some goal pads using potato sacks and some wool and some wood. So, we're talking the Depression here.
Yeah.
I believe I said he was born in 1947. That's incorrect. He was actually born in 1929. Um, but he graduated high school in 47 and began his pro career in 47. And we'll get to that a little later in the segment. But here's a kid that when he's 6 or 7 years old, all of a sudden has his first hockey equipment. Some of it's regulation, some of it's homemade, but it allowed him to start playing the game, which of course is the important part. And his father played an instrumental part in the start of his hockey career, as I say, by making his pads and obviously going out and helping him and playing with him and spending time with one of what was 11 children and working in the mines. We all know those guys worked a lot of long hours and a lot of days. So obviously time was of the essence in terms of getting together with each of his kids. But his mother also played a big part in his life. Being a large family in the Depression, his mother taught him how to knit. And for years, he was well known as knitting his own socks and knitting toques for wearing on the ice, playing hockey outside. And even in the early days of his pro career, he would actually, in the senior leagues, he would actually wear a toque to keep his head warm, especially if they were playing in an outdoor arena. So, his mother played just as big a part as his father did. He was an asthmatic from early childhood, and this condition prevented him from playing any position where he had to do a lot of skating. So he naturally gravitated to becoming a goaltender and started to play hockey, organized hockey at the age of 12. He was attending a school where the goaltender was hurt, or I believe actually may have even had a disagreement with the coach. But anyway, long story short, the coach found himself short a goaltender. Plante was anxious to play, volunteered to go in goal, picked up the game very, very quickly. By the time he was 14 years of age, he was playing on 5 different teams,
Uh-huh.
one of which was a local factory team. And he found out, this kid's 14 years old, found out that the rest of the players on the factory team were actually being paid. And of course, the reason they were being paid was because they were employees of the factory. So Plante went to the coach and said, hey, if these guys are getting paid, shouldn't I be paid as well? And just to placate him, the coach started paying him 50 cents a game. So here we have a 14-year-old kid that is already starting to show some business acumen. So I think that tells us a little bit about how sharp this man was mentally. So at this point, he's playing for 5 teams. He received an offer of $80 a week to play for the old Providence Reds of the American Hockey League. And sit back and think about it. We're talking here mid 40s. $80 a week was a tremendous amount of money. And for a kid with business acumen, surprisingly, he turned this down. The real reason he turned it down was that his parents wanted him to finish high school. And I guess he felt some loyalty to his parents that this was something he could do and should do. So he continued to play in junior leagues, part-time in some senior leagues. As I mentioned, he played with the factory team. So he was pretty active, playing for 5 teams. Pretty hard to get yourself into trouble. So that's probably what started him on a great life.
Yeah, John, and you'd have to give him credit. He knew he was going to make his money after high school, so he stuck it out. A lot of other people would have made a different decision, so we have to give him credit for that. So now we can turn to his actual professional playing career too.
Yeah, well, he graduated high school in 1947, went to work as a clerk in a Shawinigan factory, and a few weeks later, the Quebec Citadels of the Quebec Senior Hockey League offered him $85 a week to play for them, and this time he accepted.
Big money. Okay.
Yeah, oh, big money. He was probably
At the
the
time,
rich
sure.
kid in town at that time. And this is when his innovation started, and this was one of the other things he was famous for. While he was playing for the Citadels, he started to play the puck outside his crease, and his thought process there was that if he had the puck, the other team didn't have it, so therefore they couldn't shoot at him. And playing the puck outside the crease now is now standard practice for goaltenders at all levels. Now, probably don't give him credit for a lot of the things that he did come across with. But after several seasons split between the Quebec Senior Hockey League and the American Hockey League and the NHL, Plante became the Canadiens' regular goaltender in 1954-55. He won all 6 of the Stanley Cups that I mentioned in that 9-year period when he was with the Canadiens as their number one goaltender. And keep in mind that 5 of those cups between 55 and 60 came in a row. In 59-60, he introduced his second innovation, and this is the big one. He was hit in the face by a shot from Andy Bathgate of the Rangers very early in the game, and it broke his nose. And keep in mind that in those days, teams only dressed one goaltender. So off to the dressing room, he went for repairs. When he came back, he was wearing a face mask. And Toe Blake, who was the coach of the Canadiens at that time, frowned upon any thought of a mask in a game. He thought that it would inhibit the goaltender's ability to see the puck. Plante had worn the mask in practice, but as I say, Blake had forbidden him to wear it in games. Plante came back with the mask on. Blake asked him about it, and he said, if I'm going to play, I'm going to wear the mask. And Plante was smart enough to know that Blake had no option. So all of a sudden, Blake lets him play. The Canadiens win the game. Blake then goes to Plante after the game and said, okay, I gave in today. You can wear the mask until the cut from the Bathgate shot heals. Well, guess what? The Canadiens went on an 18-game unbeaten streak, and as each game went by, Blake's opposition to the mask really started to go the other way.
Yeah, that's winning. It solves a lot of these problems.
Oh, does it ever? And Plante clearly had the upper hand, and here we go. Wearing a mask in a game for the first time. And as you now know, masks are mandatory equipment for goalies, as are helmets. So he was an innovator in that regard. He did have some issues with the Canadiens. They thought his personality was a little offbeat. The Canadiens are a very traditional organization. So he was traded to the New York Rangers in a one-for-one swap. I shouldn't say a one-for-one swap. The two key players in the deal were he and the other goaltender in the deal, Gump Worsley, and there was some spare parts going each way. This was just before the 63-64 season. Rangers weren't a very good team at that time. He spent 2 very uneventful seasons in New York with the Rangers, and he decided to retire. So he spent 2 seasons working as a goalie coach, goalie consultant for a couple of NHL teams, one of which was the 67-68 expansion Oakland Seals, where ironically his former backup with the Canadiens, Charlie Hodge, was the number one goaltender. But after 2 seasons of retirement, he had the itch to return to the ice. He did that with the St. Louis Blues, and for 2 seasons, he teamed up with another veteran goalie, another Hall of Famer by the name of Glenn Hall, in a very unique arrangement, splitting the games pretty much on a 50-50 basis. And that duo won the Vezina Trophy, as I said earlier, for the outstanding goalie in the NHL in 1968-69. I mentioned that their arrangement was unique, and it was unique because each goalie would play 2 games and then would sit out for 2 games. And for the entire season, the backup goaltender was done on a rotating basis between, I think it was 3 of the St. Louis minor league players, giving each one of them a little bit of experience in an NHL environment. They rarely got to play. Plante and Hall had the bulk of the playing time, probably 95% of the playing time over the course of the season. The backup there, of course, just as a matter of cover in case there was an injury. It kept both of it. It was a great system for 2 guys that were getting on in years. I mean, we're talking about a couple of guys in their 30s in a very pressure position, playing in an expansion on an expansion team. Obviously, a lot of pressure on those 2 guys. It kept both the veteran goalies very sharp, but it also kept them well rested. And for the most part, neither one of them had to travel to another city on the day of the game. So it was actually a great arrangement when you sit and think about it. And it was an arrangement that was brought in by Scotty Bowman, who we'll also talk about in this archive series at a later date, one of the great coaches in the National Hockey League. May of 1970, brought about a rather unique transaction in the NHL, and it involved Plante. NHL expansion was coming up. Buffalo and Vancouver were coming into the league the following season. St. Louis could only protect two goaltenders. The one guy they did not want to lose was their third goaltender, a fellow by the name of Ernie Wakely. So they had to deal either Hall or Plante in order to protect Wakely. I had actually forgotten about the uniqueness of this transaction until a very good friend of mine pointed it out to me last night when we were talking about Jacques Plante. And the prior spring, the Toronto Maple Leafs had traded Tim Horton to the New York Rangers. Part of the payback to the Leafs was that ever famous future considerations. There was also another deal, I forget the details of it, between the Rangers and St. Louis, where St. Louis owed the Rangers future considerations. So the three teams got together and quickly decided that the Blues would sell Plante to the Toronto Maple Leafs for cash, and all of the future transactions or future considerations would be forgotten. Those deals were closed. So the slate was wiped clean. Plante ended up in Toronto, playing as the number one goaltender for almost 3 seasons. Kind of an interesting situation. Plante played very well when he was in Toronto behind what was not a very good hockey team. His main role there was to serve as a mentor for an upcoming goaltender by the name of Bernie Parent, who we all remember as being the goaltender on the 2 Stanley Cup championship teams of the Philadelphia Flyers. Plante was Parent's idol, and it was just a great duo in terms of mixing match of youth and veterans and knowledge and somebody eager to learn. So Plante played a very big part in shaping Bernie Parent as a world-class NHL goaltender. And his final trade in hockey was late in 1972-73 when he was traded to the Boston Bruins. I think he played 8 or 10 games for the Bruins. Didn't play there very long, but he played very well in the short time that he was there. So at this point, he retires for the second time in 1973. And, then he starts thinking about what his post NHL career might look like. So he jumped right in 73, 74. He took the dual role as GM and coach of the Quebec Nordique of the then new World Hockey Association. Team went 38, 36, and 4. But after the season, Plante decided he wanted yet another crack at playing. So signed a 1-year contract with the WHA Edmonton Oilers. Keep in mind, at this point, this man's 45 years old, and he played 1 season with the Oilers, getting into 31 games. So not exactly a full-time role, but certainly not sitting on the bench and going in and making an appearance. So obviously he had a career outside of hockey or post-hockey to think about. During his first retirement in the 1960s, he dabbled a little bit in broadcasting, doing some color work and some analysis on Quebec Junior Hockey League games. He was also the analyst for the Canadian French language transmissions on television for the 1972 Summit Series between the Canadians and the Soviet Union.
I would imagine that there might be some nice jobs in French language TV broadcasting for some of these ex-players, a real specialty niche. That just kind of popped into my head when you were talking about this.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And in those days, Plante's English, of course, was excellent. It was not his first language. It was not his best language. He would speak French if he had the opportunity. But for somebody like that, it was an excellent role. The man that had most of the fame for doing Montreal Canadiens telecasts in the English network or on the English network was a fellow by the name of Danny Gallivan, who's a legend, Hall of Famer himself. He's from the Maritimes, but Gallivan's first language was English. So it was necessary to bring in a French Canadian, obviously, on the French telecasts, and Gallivan's equivalent on the French broadcast was a gentleman by the name of René Lecavalier, and he was just as famous as Mel Allen. He was just as famous as Gallivan was, but on the French network. So he worked with Plante, to excellent hockey minds, covering a very important series. Plante also wrote extensively on hockey, primarily writing columns for local newspapers, and also for a while he wrote a hockey column for Sport magazine when it was a big magazine in the U.S. He also published a book, ironically, simply called Goaltending, and that book was published both in English and in French. In 1967, while he was thinking about coming back for the first time, he also started instructing at hockey schools, and as a result of that, he became very well known as a teacher and an instructor. He also spent some time coaching and consulting with the goaltenders for the Oakland Seals, the Philadelphia Flyers, the Canadiens, and the St. Louis Blues. So he was certainly still close to the game, even in his retirement. After his retirement, he moved to Switzerland in 1975, and that coincided with the passing of his youngest son. It was time to get out of playing hockey. It was time to move to another country, start a new life, and work on his new skills. And unfortunately, in the fall of 1985, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer. It was obviously advanced at the time that it was diagnosed, and unfortunately, he passed away in February of 1986, and he was only 57 years old. So not an old man by any stretch of the imagination. When we talk on these shows, we often talk about how a person is remembered and what is their legacy, and a number of things we can remember Plante for, and some of the things we've already covered, and we'll kind of touch on them briefly again. But one of the things I always remember about him was he was always good with a quote. And one of his famous quotes, somebody asked him about what it was like to be a National Hockey League goaltender, an obvious question, I guess, for anybody that was talking to a National Hockey League goaltender. And his response was, and I quote, "Suppose you were working at your job one day and you made a little mistake. Then all of a sudden, a red light went on over your desk and 15,000 people stood up and yelled at you that you sucked," unquote. I guess that kind of tells you what it's like to be an NHL goaltender and translates it into everyday life for those of us that are in everyday life.
I haven't had 15,000 people do that, but I've had a couple that have said that.
Oh, I think we all have. And, he was also known for his sharpness. While he was playing for the Canadiens, he claimed that the nets in all the NHL arenas were not a standard size. Said that the nets in Chicago, Boston, and New York were slightly smaller, thereby giving an advantage to the goalies that played for those teams. Everybody kind of laughed at it, but shortly thereafter, the claim was later confirmed when the NHL did a survey on the goals, and they found out that the nets in those three cities actually were smaller. It was a result of a manufacturing error. So, here's a guy that his eyes were pretty sharp. He was known for his innovations. Talked about some of the things that he brought in, but he was one of the first goaltenders to shout instructions to his defenseman during play. He was one of the first goaltenders to skate behind the net, stop the puck. He was the first goaltender to play the puck extensively outside his crease, as I mentioned earlier, when he was with the Citadels. He was the first goaltender to raise his arm when a linesman was signaling icing to let his defenseman know exactly what was going on. So, here's a guy that's responsible for a lot of things that we take as everyday behavior now in the NHL. Talked about some highlights at the top of the segment. Most of the following highlights that I'm going to mention were posthumous highlights. Obviously, dying at 57 years old, they weren't able to recognize all of the good things that he should have been recognized for during his lifetime. But he was elected posthumously to the Quebec Sports Hall of Fame in 1994. His number 1 jersey was retired by the Canadiens in 1995. The Jacques Plante Memorial Trophy was established in his memory by the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League and awarded to the outstanding goaltender in that league each year. The Swiss Hockey Federation created the Jacques Plante Trophy. It recognizes the top goaltender in Switzerland each year. The arena in Shawinigan, Quebec, where he grew up, has been renamed the Arena Jacques Plante. Sports Illustrated named him to Sports Illustrated magazine, of course, I refer to, named him to the 91 all-time all-star team behind Vladislav Tretiak of the Soviet Union, and that's pretty high company to be in with Tretiak. His donning of the mask in 1959, as we talked about, has been documented as an installment of the CBC Heritage Minute series that is shown on Canadian television. So, here's a guy that did an awful lot for hockey, and you sit back and think about it. Heck of a lot of achievements, Dave, for a guy that was only 57 years old, and he packed an awful lot into those 57 years.
He most certainly did. And what a great job, John, on outlining the career of NHL standout Jacques Plante right here on the Sports Archives.